Good afternoon, students, faculty, and friends. My name is Taylor Hemphill, and I am a student ambassador and the Women's Center with the Unity Wing here at Eastern Connecticut State University. In collaboration with the Office of Equity and Diversity, we are proud to host today's University Hour, Time with Betsy Wade, a legend and the fight for women's rights. Like many of us, by the age of 13, Betsy had an idea of what she wanted to do. She knew that she wanted to be a journalist. With that, she worked eagerly to learn skills and solidified her ambition. After Barnard College, Betsy attended the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and was one of 10 women in her class of 60-some students. In 1952, Betsy was employed at the New York Herald Tribune and Women's News, but was let go the following year when she informed the newspaper staff that she was pregnant. Though dispirited, Betsy never gave up on her dream of becoming a journalist. It was later in 1956 that Betsy would become the first to hold a job as a copy editor. The paper was more than 100 years old by then. Betsy did not allow gender barriers to hold her back. In fact, she confronted them head-on. In 1970, Betsy and women coworkers filed a sex discrimination lawsuit and successfully sued the Times for gender bias. Betsy's herstory is one that tells the story of a woman committed to becoming the person that she dreamed to be, and one committed to doing their part to break down barriers for future generations. Betsy was a 2014 recipient of the Ella T. Grasso Award. Her legacy is a search for justice and fairness. Clarity and civility are tools. She reminds us to share what we have, absorb what we hear. Please join me in welcoming Betsy Wade.
Very nicely done, a fine ambassador. Am I turned on now? Okay, good. The first thing I want to do before we get into this, if any of you can't hear me in the back, please come toward the front, is why are you here today? I know why I'm here, but I want to know why you're here. So someone here in the front, tell me, why are you here today? You.
I wanted to hear what you had to say. I want to hear your story.
I will be delighted to tell my story if somebody pokes me in the right part and says, tell that part of the story. I think my introduction had a very, very adequate introduction to somebody whom I barely know at all. I'm not legendary. I'm pretty ordinary, and the luckiest thing that ever happened to me is my family, but I'll leave that to you. Young man there on the aisle, why are you here?
If I want to work towards a better world, you've already done that. You've already made your mark in the world, making it better, whether it's small ways or notable ways. So you're a role model, and role models are the best people to follow.
That's a wonderful answer. I like that very much. I will try to live up to that because I think that's the way I figure it out. But when you invite somebody on a Wednesday afternoon that's cold and cold on the outside and you say, come hear somebody talk about herself, I think there's something in your mind that says, what is it about her that I want to know about? Does anybody have anything particular that you'd like to know about, that I might know something about? Ma'am, the Boston fan.
I'm open to hearing anything.
You're open to hearing anything. Well, I don't know whether my anything is going to match this, but we will certainly try to talk about these things that maybe you haven't heard. Who knows? I'd like to see a couple of hands, maybe more than one hand. Who knows what Shirley Chisholm did? Aha. What did you're my son. I'm not allowed to ask you to answer. What did Shirley Chisholm do, Ben?
She ran for president.
She ran for president. That was what she did. But she was not the first woman to run for president. Shirley Chisholm, who came from Brooklyn, who was in Congress, who was an outstandingly tough and strong woman, was not the first. The first one was a woman named Victoria Claflin Woodhull, who was a scandalous, totally scandalous woman back in the 19th century. And what she did was she and her sister opened a newspaper. They also opened a brokerage house down on Wall Street in New York. And then one day she put on her feathered hat and said, and I'm going to run for president too. And she didn't do very well at it, but this was before women could vote. Who knows how long ago women were able to vote? Does anybody remember the date?
I'll tell you the year, 1920.
Very good. Excellent. We're coming up on the centennial. And one of the things I did in the last couple of weeks in order not to think about facing this room of over-intelligent, over-educated people and trying to answer their questions was I helped to set up an exhibition in New York in which we had pictures of many of the people we're talking about today who led the way politically. And I'm sure you all know, because I'm sure you've all had American history, what it was that Frances Perkins did. What did Frances Perkins do? Any of you in social work study Frances Perkins? Can't hear you. Frances Perkins was having tea one day, and as a matter of fact, today is the anniversary, in Washington Square, New York, when suddenly there were sirens everywhere. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was on fire. That was the day when she walked out and she saw that what was happening was that these girls and women who worked in this factory, which was locked from the outside, were jumping to their deaths because there was no other way to go. The fire was at their back. And Frances Perkins, when she testified later on in a women's oral history, said, there was nothing to stand there, nothing to do but stand there with your hand on your heart, because you could not stop them and you knew that was what was going to happen. It didn't change the course of her life. Frances Perkins was already a social worker, but it changed her in that the governor of the state of New York put her in charge of an investigation of factory safety. There was a day when there were no laws for factory safety. There was a day when there was no time whatsoever where anybody said, this room may be occupied by 155 people and no more, or the fire chief will be here for you. So she held hearings in Lower New York, which was most of New York in those days. And people came and they talked about the safety of their work. They talked about the fact that girls and women, remember child labor was not enacted, that girls and women would be exploited right down to their feet. And I think this part of New England, you probably have photographs in all of your hospitals, you have photographs in all of your post offices. You have paintings that show that it was child labor that built many of these huge factories and mills. Well, how do you start? Well, you start with one event and you start with one woman, Frances Perkins, and when she finished, they started to enact laws to protect workers and to keep children from being locked into factories, and to protect those who had to go and handle dangerous substances. And how did New York make an effect? New York made an effect because the next governor of New York was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who then became the President of the United States. So we're talking about the early 30s now. We're moving up to your grandparents' period. And if your grandparents are alive, you probably should ask them about what various things were like at that time. And they can tell you things that you will be very surprised at, and until you ask them, they won't tell you. Every once in a while, one of my grandchildren says, well, what did you do when that happened? I said, you have to understand, there were no cell phones. There weren't any telephones. This is not back at the time of the Civil War. This is when my parents were growing up and I was growing up. So Frances Perkins was asked by Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States, to come be the Secretary of Labor. She would be the first woman in any cabinet in the United States, and she would be the Secretary of Labor because she had studied work laws, labor laws, industrial laws. And she gave him a list. It was like a marriage, if you want to look at it that way. She said, here are the things I want if I work for you, and you have to agree with me that you will do all of these if I come to be in your cabinet. And Roosevelt agreed to them. And one of them was Social Security. So in 1937, when I was a very small girl, for the first time they began to take a little piece of everybody's pay and put it over here, and the employer put a little piece over here. It was 1% when it started out, and all kinds of places were excluded. Hospitals were excluded. Nonprofit organizations were excluded. But places like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were not excluded. So that was where the money came from that I am able to now be retired on. I worked for 45 years for the New York Times. I worked for several years for Scripps Howard. I worked before that. Before that, I worked in hospitals, but that wasn't covered by Social Security. I was only 18, but it didn't have mattered if I was 30. When they finally got hospitals covered, they brought a huge number of women into the Social Security system because so many employees in hospitals were women. I'm not talking about doctors. They aren't employees. I'm talking about the women who mop the floor, the women who make the beds, the women who do the nursing, the women who do the cleaning, all of that. My goodness, I've exhausted myself. Tell me something now about what would be a worthwhile piece of progress for us to bring around if somebody were to say, okay, everybody in this room, we're all going to get together and now we're going to go try to change something. Tell me.
Paid family leave. Paid family leave.
Family relief? I didn't hear the first word.
Paid family leave. So when
Oh, paid family leave. I think that this is one that has been such a difficult question, but I think it is such a very good point. Working while you're pregnant is endurable, but let us say, for instance, that you've got other children. Somebody needs to watch out for the other children. So the father becomes a very important person in this role. Or the partner becomes a very important person in this role. I wonder how it would be that we would go to legislate for this. Where would we go to seek a place? Anyone have an idea? You must be thinking about this.
Hartford, Washington.
Yeah, I mean, what would you go with? What would you have in your hand?
Statistics. And
Statistics.
both statistics and anecdotes from families dealing with the issues associated with not having family leave.
Yes.
And stories from families who live in other countries who have some of the best paid family leave in the world, just so like they can see the benefits, they can see the disparities, and they can see the numerical data surrounding this issue.
It's an extremely interesting point, and you have a very good piece of information there, because in the Scandinavian countries, these things are all built into the system. And if you are going to do the expansion of your family, then you are able to get time off and do things that make the life more tolerable in this highly pressed time. But the problem here in the United States seems to be that somehow this is not construed as being something that is good for the country, but merely something for some lazy woman who doesn't want to get out of bed after she's had a baby. I look around in the streets where people are carrying signs, and that's a good sign. That's something we need to do. That's something we need to think about. I don't think any of these issues have gone away. I don't think the issue of equality of pay for women has gone away. I think if you look at the statistics, as you said, and they are there, you can look at them. When I was at the Times, one of the advantages that I had because I was a union member was I was able to look at the charts, not the names, but the charts for how long people had worked, how much they were making, and what their gender was. And you could see these gaping differences in there. And I suspect that the charts these days might not really be too much better off. I think they are, I think that women are underpaid by and large, and I think some of it is, well, let's look at the occupational. How many women automobile repair people have you seen lately? Any? I saw one once. Do women want to repair cars? I think some of them do. I think a lot of them do. I don't know whether they can get into the technical schools. Can you tell me? Do you know? Automobile repair shops? Well, there we are. I guess nobody's heard about it, so I guess it hasn't happened. But certainly, if you look at the whole repair of the infrastructure, bridges, streets, highways, subways, bus systems, you don't see a huge number of women, do you? I don't know how many factors play into this one. I know when I was making my way through as a woman in a world of men, there were factors that were both subtle and overt. When I went to work for the Times as a copy editor, I was one of 60 or 70 copy editors. Because you have a 7-day operation, you've got to have a lot of people because you're going to be doubling up a lot of the time. And the room where they worked was set up for men. I mean, no one thought about anything else. And they had cuspidors. 1956, cuspidors. So they apparently went around and they said, we've got this girl working here, and we're not going to have any more cuspidors. Just learn to go to the toilet and deal with things. So one guy was so angry about the loss of his cuspidor that he got an empty can for the 3-pound coffee can. Have you seen a 3-pound coffee can? And he kept it by his chair. while he worked. And when he got up to leave work, he took this can and he walked about as far from me as I am from that spot in the floor, sloshing the can ever so slightly. And I thought, you know, if I don't throw up, it's only because I'm extremely strong and I'm going to defeat this guy, and the way I'm going to defeat him is by not throwing up. It went on until he retired. But he also said to the boss, he said, if you put that woman on my desk, I quit. So you have to think about the kinds of discrimination, the kinds of bad treatment. Perhaps women should go in and say, here, I know how to do that lug nut. Let me have a shot at it. Anybody here ever tried to get a job that they felt they were being held out of because of gender? Yes. What kind of a job was it?
It was a factory job back in the early 80s. I was in my about 20 years old, and one of the factory jobs in the area, and it was a position in the factory I wanted. And I was already working there, but I was on the floor with the other ladies, and they said, you can't do this job because you're not whatever. I didn't fight it at the time because I didn't know any better.
Yeah. I think that,
And I'm glad because I don't want to be there anymore.
well, also because you were by yourself. I mean, I think that's the key. Don't ever try to fight one of these things by yourself. I met a young woman from the International Ladies Garment Workers Union early in my life in the labor movement. And she said, do not get out on a limb all by yourself because they will surely saw it off. So the answer is get some people with you. Talk to some people. You'll be surprised how many will say, oh, he did that? I thought I was the only one. And you will be quite interested. It is not as if men are not discriminated against. Men can be discriminated against for dozens of different reasons. All of the reasons that women have, and then perhaps some other ones. Perhaps they don't want a man fitting women's clothes in the garment district. I don't know. Most of the great couturiers, of course, are men. Chanel was really the exception. What else do we need to know about how we can build a slightly better world, as the gentleman says? Can't tell me you know all of it. Which one of you now is trying to make your way through a difficult situation? Ma'am. Be sure that I can hear you.
Well, I come from Honduras, right? So the society there tends to be a little more sexist than it is here in the United States. And I have had my little issues to overcome, but something that I always try to make a rule for myself is always give the best of me, and I don't think that will be overlooked by anybody regardless of my gender, right? I always try to work the hardest, try to do my best even if it won't always get recognized. I do believe that when the time comes and when it's most important that it will. So, yeah.
But suppose you're going to make a mistake. You will make a mistake. I would show you some of my mistakes if I weren't embarrassed to hide them. What will you do when that happens? Oh, good. What a good idea. Devices. What will you do when you make a mistake?
When I make a mistake?
Make a mistake? Yes.
But
You put the wrong thing down in the wrong place. You answered the question wrong. We all make mistakes. How will you handle that?
You try to make it right. You try to fix it.
That's good. I think the best thing, and perhaps the newspaper headlines these days tell us, you'll only get in deeper if you try to cover it up. You might as well say, I was the one who put the stuff from the blue wastebasket in the green wastebasket. I don't think it'll happen again because I'm getting much better at colors or whatever it is that you're getting better at. But I think that probably fessing up is the best way to do it.
Yeah,
Somebody
honestly,
said to
it
me one
takes-
time, don't you know anything? Don't you know how to spell Bleecker Street? And I said, well, I do now. But by that time, it was in the paper in letters this big. So you just live with it. You pretend it didn't happen, but it happened, and you have to say it.
Honestly, it takes a lot of courage to do that. I don't see that as something bad, like taking ownership for what you've done wrong. I think it makes you stronger, and it actually gains you more respect with other people, right?
I think it makes you, as Jimmy Breslin used to say, you get inside of somebody else's head. You understand how they feel after you've had the experience, and you know what it is they probably want most at that time. Somebody to get off their neck, perhaps, who knows. I think that pressing on is good, but do you feel any of your issues at the moment, or I'm trying to cure myself of the word issues, which has come to mean everything from a very bad attack of measles to a stubbed toe.
Some of the issues haven't been overcome entirely because a lot of them depend on certain people changing their mentality. Changing a mentality is hard, right? So that's what I'm trying to say.
Certain people changing themselves, you mean?
Yeah, changing themselves. Specifically, I was thinking of like my dad, you know, getting him to understand certain things, right? Like, for example, that I am capable of certain works, of achieving certain things just like my brother, right? Like, I should be taken seriously in certain aspects that I'm not, right? See, like, that's his mentality because of where we grew up, right? Like, women are not as tough, women can't handle this, right? You leave this to the men. That's how it was back home, but that's how he grew up, and mostly because that's how his parents taught him also. And sadly,
you're talking about 2 generations behind you and your generation, and your father doesn't think you're up to your brother.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's going to have, I don't know how old you are, but I think it's going to have a few more years to run, and then you will be governing your own life, and some of that is going to be awfully hard, especially if you get an offer for a job that's going to take you far away from your father, where he can't supervise you anymore. But I think that's a very tough one to have it in your own family. I think that all of these things run both ways. My grandmother was an illegal immigrant into the United States. I never realized the implications of this until after she wanted to, later, when she was a grandmother, she wanted to go home and see Ireland. She couldn't leave the country because she had no papers. She would never be able to come back again. And I think one of the aspects of the stress in that family was that my mother thought that her mother-in-law was really dopey. And she wasn't dopey. She was smart. She had survived in a situation that most of us couldn't survive in. So you will find your freedom out there somehow, but it's not going to go away in a day.
But
Anyone else got a foot stuck in a tough door?
Absolutely, but that's why I was going back to like my point that I think like the best way to deal with these issues is do it by example, because I'm not gonna like force feed this into my dad, like, Dad, this is how it is, this is a new generation, you know? Like, just like I could argue with him about this over and over again, but it won't get anywhere. So the best I can think of is like be the example, right? Show it through my actions that I am capable, not so much with my words. And I feel it should be like that with everybody else, right? All these women should be, instead of like telling them like I'm worth this, right, or I can achieve this, show them, like work towards it. And I'm not saying there won't be obstacles, but I always think that door of opportunity will open itself.
I think that's extremely sound advice for young folks, including you. Arguing won't get you there. I'd like to talk about, did I go out of range there? I'd like to talk about a couple of other people that we would be interested in. Can I see hands on people who know who Margaret Sanger is? Okay. My belief is that probably everyone who is here either does know who Margaret Sanger is or is capable of finding out who Margaret Sanger is. Betsy Wade, did it the easy way. She wanted a job. She wanted to be in journalism. She wanted to help people learn things they needed to know to live in a democracy. All of this is relatively simple compared with what Margaret Sanger wanted to do. Margaret Sanger wanted to turn the world upside down. She wanted to enable women not to get pregnant every time they had intercourse. The advice of most nurses at that time Margaret Sanger was doing her work was, tell your husband to sleep on the roof, which is not very useful advice, particularly if the husband has all the money, has all the control, pays the rent, and figures he bought you on the open market. So Margaret Sanger started publishing, and this is everywhere I turn I find publishing, and I don't mean to advocate publishing for any of you. I'm just saying it's a way of letting people know things. Margaret Sanger began to publish a newspaper in which she said, in my next issues of this newspaper, I plan to tell you how to avoid getting pregnant. And the government said this was obscenity. Not telling, but saying you're going to tell them in the future. So they arrested Margaret Sanger and they indicted her. And she had the peculiar situation, the big courthouse in New York there was just practically where City Hall is now. And in addition to it was the post office. So she would go in and she would mail her publication, and then they would take the publication out of the other place and go out to arrest Margaret Sanger. So she tried to make up her mind what it was she was going to do. And she knew that if she was sent to prison, she was going to have that with her forever. They would say, here comes the jailbird, here comes the jailbird. They wouldn't even know that what she had committed was offense of the Postal Act. So she decided that she would leave, and she went overnight, and she went to Canada. And she left Canada, and she traveled on. Her story is a wonderful story, and if any of you are running out of exciting things to write about in the recent past, or want to make any comparisons for this kind of thing, take Margaret Sanger. She stayed out there until they finally got bored with it and didn't care whether she came home or not. And when she got off the vessel that brought her back from Europe, so she says in her book, I can hardly believe this story, and the boat pulled in down by where South Ferry is in New York now. She looks down, and the newspapers that are on the newsstand just outside of the boat landing use the word birth control on page 1, which was the phrase she had devised. She liked family planning better, but birth control seemed to take, And she looked at it and she realized that if it was on the front page of the paper there in New York, it was probably okay to come home. And from then on, she advocated, she built clinics, she financed clinics. Eventually, Margaret Sanger's enterprise became Planned Parenthood. She was completely concerned with the health and the well-being of women as women. And she worked and worked and worked. And her family, she had a family, yes. Her family is still around. She is gone. But when we worked on the history of women who had changed New York, my husband and I, Margaret Sanger was tops on the list. Because certainly as we spread out from New York with the Frances Perkins story, we spread out from New York with Margaret Sanger and with her enterprise. Read about her. There was a movie about her, a documentary on television sometimes. And if you have meetings about women and women's rights and marital relations, it's a good movie for you to look at. Are there some questions? I've always liked to hear questions because then I know what you're thinking about. No? Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask because I have to head out. I'm going to go back to your lawsuit.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier not to go out on a limb by yourself.
Yes.
So I don't have the details in terms of when you filed this suit, you mentioned you were involved in the labor movement. Was the labor movement supporting you on this lawsuit? Was this something that you did as an individual?
I'm happy to hear the question because it gives me an opportunity to elucidate, and I hope you don't have to leave right away. In those days, we're talking about, in those days, the 1970s, the class action suit was a very popular attack on things that seemed to be offending or bothering a lot of people. For instance, if all of the people who went to a certain place came down with a certain kind of disease, you would bring a class action suit in behalf of all of those people in the hope of stopping the disease. So the New York Times had approximately 2,000 employees at that time. 600 of them were women. The major part of the 600 women were the women who worked in the classified ad department. Now, the classified ad department is a long time ago, but it was all of those little things that said help wanted, jobs, houses for sale, you know, what have you, all kinds of little things where they were just little tiny ads. And they would call up and they would say, hello, this is Betsy Wade from the New York Times. I understand you're trying to sell your grocery. We'd like you to place an ad and so forth. But they were the ones who brought in the big bucks. People like me from the news department did not bring in big bucks. We spent bucks, not big bucks, but we spent them. So we wrote a letter in behalf of all of the women at the Times. 60 of us signed it to the owners of the paper. It was at that point a privately held paper. There was stock, but the stock was controlled by the family, the Sulzberger family, which had owned it for, 80 years or thereabouts. And we said, we aren't getting paid what the men are getting paid. Most of your money is coming from the classified ad salespeople, but they are never permitted to transfer over from selling ads on the phone to going out and selling ads to Macy's and Wanamaker's and Brooks Brothers and saying we want to have a lovely big ad in your department in our paper. So we wrote the letter, nothing happened. We had conversations, nothing happened. We solved a couple of individual problems of, for instance, people who were getting advanced degrees and who had work schedules that permitted them to get to class by 7 o'clock at night. And then suddenly they would discover that they couldn't do that. And we got those small things solved, but the greater picture was the same. Finally, the whole notion of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is employment discrimination, which is what most of you are going to find yourself reading if you find yourself in a job where you're not getting a fair shake. You'll find that Title VII is there, although well amended at this point in the game. They were trying to teach the law schools how to handle cases of employment discrimination. So an assistant dean from Columbia Law School came down and said, I understand you guys are looking for a lawyer. And we said, oh, indeed we are. What do you suggest? What should we do? And so on. So she began to outline for us what the conditions were that we had to do in order to be certified as a class. That's the key term there. Certifies as a class. We have the same problems, we have similar needs, we have experienced the same sorts of put-aways, forget about it, go-aways. And this started in 1972, and in 1978, the case was settled. I can't say it was settled in favor of the Times, and it probably wasn't settled in favor of the women. But I want to tell you that the impact in the other papers in the country was huge. We got phone calls, we got letters, we got communications, and what they were saying was, if the New York Times can't beat a bunch of 600 women who probably don't know which end is up anyway, what on earth is the Willimantic Spool going to do to fight its employees? At the same time, there was a case going on by the non-white employees of the Times, which also included women. So some of these women were in there fighting it on two fronts, which were really the same front. And the evidence was damning. It was really horrifying. There were notes about job interviews in which they said, she sure is cute and she wears her clothes well. This is the kind of thing that nobody who is an employer anymore permits anybody to write down, even on a piece of water when they're writing with more water. But in those days, they had done it all the time. So it went on, and the case was resolved. There was a cash settlement for all of the women who were members of the class, that is, who had been working for the Times at the time the suit began. And there was also an affirmative action plan. I'm sure you've all heard this phrase. An affirmative action plan that the Times had to agree to, and our lawyer was the countersign for us in that case. How did I get to have my name on this thing when there were 600 plaintiffs and 7 named plaintiffs? That is to say, people who were prepared to testify in court about their own situations. The answer is the alphabet. When the 7 named plaintiffs were lined up, my married name, which is Boylan, was the first alphabetically. So it was Betsy Wade Boylan, Louise Carini, Joan Cook, on down the line to the end. And for whatever reasons, that's the way it was listed in the roster of the federal court. On good days when the wind isn't blowing, I can remember the number. but it starts out with Civ 74, meaning it went to court in 74. Thank you very much for asking. It was a somewhat nervy time. I was standing at a bar one night, and the man next to me said, "You don't want my job." I said, "No, I don't want your job, Larry. I want the next job ahead of yours. I want an equal shot at that." It was something that was little understood. There was often, like all civil rights battles, everyone thinks somebody is coming to take something away from you. Someone is not coming to take something away from you. Somebody is coming to make it distribute more equally, at the best we can. But thank you. Are you a lawyer?
No, I'm just thinking, my daughter's a journalist, and so I'm thinking as she enters the field, or has entered the field, the battles that she's going to encounter, even in 2016, 2017.
She's how old?
23.
23. That's a good age. I mean, I'm sure she's learning a lot of technical stuff. Please tell her to learn how to write the English language if they've been keeping this from her. It's a wonderful skill. Yes, sir. Am I hearing? There's one.
Did the Guild help you and support you in this struggle?
My union, the Newspaper Guild. Yes, the union did indeed help. The first part of the question was, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, those of you who have dealt with union contracts, the management is compelled to give certain types of information to the union in advance of bargaining for a new contract. How many employees are there? What's the average payroll? All of these various pieces of information. So one of the things that we were able to get access to by asking the union was, we want to hear what the payrolls in various departments look like. We weren't going to ask, what does Betsy Wade make? But tell me what's the highest paid person in the editorial department? Who is the highest paid person in the classified ad department? Who is the lowest paid person? So that you could look at this thing. Well, the thing that we discovered very quickly was, and it was a whoop and a holler, the woman who had been in the news department the longest, a woman named Edith Evans Asbury, was making less than 10 people above her. And she was well thought of. We also discovered that when you took the Washington Bureau payroll, and we didn't even do this, they did it themselves. When you took the Washington Bureau payroll, that's all the people who cover the White House, who cover Congress, who do all that stuff, and you put it down just as numbers. They copied this and they sent it to me. Just the numbers. You know, here's $100, here's $95, and then they got through so that they had enough numbers for all of the people in the Washington Bureau. All of the women were in the bottom half. And the black woman was the bottom of the bottom half. And nobody had to explain that to us. And the woman who covered Congress saw it. She had thought this whole idea of a lawsuit was preposterous. She sort of, went like a rocket this way, and she came around and she said, "Where do I sign? What do you need? What are you looking for? What kind of help do you want? Do you need bombs?" And we said, "No, we don't need bombs. Just sit back down and we'll get there in time. But we've got to have you." And it was a great, terrible moment. First of all, she knew that the leading person in the Washington Bureau at that time, some of you would know, I'm sure, a man named James B. Reston, had been lying to her for 15 years. And once she understood that, she said, there's no truth in any of these people. We said, there's truth in the payroll. And that was, the union was extremely helpful without violating any of the rules that there were. And when the black suit went on longer, that is the suit of the non-white employees, which also include Asians, that as long as they had to go on, the Newspaper Guild paid the lawyers for the other lawsuit. And that's settled in a different manner from the way ours settled. I see people going. Do you guys have a class? Yeah. Okay. It was a pleasure to meet you. Where's our boss? Okay, sure. It's okay. Well, shall we talk about playing poker? If there's anything else, I'm happy to talk some more, but if you guys gotta get along, by all means do. It's been wonderful to be here with you. Oh, I can't see in the light. Yes, ma'am.
You had mentioned Jimmy Breslin before, and he just passed away. Did you work? You must have worked with him.
I worked with Jimmy Breslin. I worked with him at the Scripps Howard Feature Syndicate, but I also, you know, his second wife was our member of the city council. She represented our neighborhood. So we saw and hung out with them pretty well, and our kids were about the same age as some of his. We had 2, and he had 6, but that's 2 of his died.
Yeah.
It's terrible to lose your own child. Just
2 daughters, I think, right?
beg pardon?
Was it 2 daughters?
I think it was
Yeah,
2
yeah.
daughters, yeah. But fabulous writer, you know, just unbelievably good, and so, what is the word I want? Right to the throat.
It was blunt, but in an elegant way.
Yeah. Did you read him?
Yeah, I read some of his stuff, and you know, I've known about him over the years.
Okay.
You know, but him, along with many of your other cohorts, you must have a lot of stories to tell about your days in the time with all these different people, these different writers, little adventures that you've had, fights that you've fought and won or lost. You know.
Oh, indeed. You know, you stand me up with a glass of beer, and I have a long night of anecdotes. But not too much should be made of any of those. Jimmy and I had great respect for each other, and we never, after Scripps Howard, we never worked for the same paper again. But we ran into each other when we were, you know, doing things or going places or making trouble. I have brought with me a gift for your library. This is the book that was written about the lawsuit. I didn't write it. Not only I didn't have the time, I certainly didn't have the crust. But Nan Robertson, it's called The Girls in the Balcony, which is a wonderful double-edged title. And this is a story about the Times lawsuit. It was published in the 1990s. This is the hardcover, the first edition. The paperback edition has been corrected, but I know that librarians always want the hardcover. So this is for your library. If anybody wants to read the inside story of Betsy Wade and how we stirred up the newspaper world, it'll be there, and I hope forever. I believe in books. Okay,